Welcome to Madang Podcast. Today's special guest is Dr. Eddie Glaude Jr., who is a James S. McDonnell Distinguished University Professor at Princeton University. Today he shares about Malcolm X, Dr. King, Ella Baker, Black leadership, family relationships, and his book, We Are the Leaders We Have Been Looking For, and so much more. Please stay tuned. Homebrew Christianity's Theology Beer Camp tickets are now available. It will be held October 17 to 19 in Denver with fabulous speakers such as Diana Butler-Bass, Brian McLaren, Ilya Delio, and John Tatalamo, and so many more. Please go to www.theologybeer.camp to register. You can use discount code Return of Madang for $25 off registration. Please register today. Join Homebrew Christianity's new online class, Faith and Politics for the Rest of Us, led by Dr. Diana Butler-Bass, Dr. Tripp Fuller, and Tim Whitaker. They're bringing together a number of alternative theopolitical visions to introduce a multiplicity of vibrant yet neglected traditions in public theology. With the help of some of the most powerful voices in the Academy, participants will be introduced to these traditions and get to put them into action as we wrestle with our present moment, discovering the potential for an alternative public Christian witness. You will get 5 live stream sessions, Q&A time, online community, and so much more. Please go to www.faithandpolitics.net to register for this upcoming amazing new class. 1001 New Worshiping Communities has been igniting and supporting flourishing new faith communities in every context through the Presbyterian Church USA since 2012. 1001 has started over 750 communities and has trained over 1,000 leaders to begin creative, diverse, and new expressions of what it means to follow Jesus. You can hear about those stories on their podcast called New Way, which you can find on their website, newchurchnewway.org. 1001 will be sponsoring a tent at the Wild Goose Festival this year called the Tent of Make-Believe. So please register for the Wild Goose Festival and meet 1001 there.
For sponsorship inquiries, please email madangpodcast@gmail.com. This is Madang, an outdoor living room for guests to share their experiences and their work. I invite you to come in and stay for a while.
Welcome to Madang Podcast. Today's very special guest is Dr. Eddie S. Glaude Jr. He is the author of many books, including Democracy in Black and the New York Times bestseller, Begin Again, winner of the Harriet Beecher Stowe Book Prize. He frequently appears in the media as an MSNBC contributor on programs like Morning Joe and Deadline White House. A native of Moss Point, Mississippi, Glaude is the James S. McDonnell Distinguished University Professor at Princeton University. He's here to discuss his new book, We Are the Leaders We Have Been Looking For. And Henry Gates Jr. writes, like attending a jazz concert with all of one's favorite musicians, James Baldwin, Martin Luther King Jr., Malcolm X, Ella Baker, Toni Morrison, and more, Glaude brilliantly takes us on an epic tour through their lives and work. So, Eddie, I know you're like one of the busiest people I know on this planet. So I'm just so grateful that you can come on Madang Podcast to share your latest book, We Are the Leaders We Have Been Looking For.
Grace, it is Absolutely a blessing and honor to be in conversation with you. Thank you for making the time for me. I appreciate it.
Oh, wow. Well, I've always wanted you to come on, and when you shared this on Twitter, I was like, "I have to get you on for this one because it's
Uh,
so exciting." So and before we get into the book, I also wanted to say thank you for the afterword you wrote for Reverend Jackson's book. It's
mm,
behind me, Keeping Hope Alive. So thank you so much for that.
sure, sure. It was my honor to do that as well. So
Yeah, and
it's good to see it.
it's finally gonna go into paperback this summer, so,
Excellent.
excited about it, so thank you again because I know you got a million projects going on. You're on TV all the time. You are doing what everybody wants to be doing, but we cannot do, so thank you. Thank you so much for coming
Thank you.
on. So today we're going to talk about your new book, We Are the Leaders We Have Been Looking For. I must say, I love the cover. I
Thank you.
love the whole feel of it. And this is a book that you turned into from your W.E.B. Du Bois lecture at Harvard in 2011. So congratulations on this new book.
Thank you so much. Thank you so much. It's been a an extraordinary run so far. It's been a surprise. So I'm really excited about it. Yeah.
Oh, that's so good. And, for like people like me, I write the book and then I give the lecture, but you gave the lecture and then you turned it into a book. So how was that process?
You know, it was a very long one. I
Oh,
delivered these lectures in 2011,
uh-huh,
and in some ways they were Grace. They were the soil. I mean, they were this moment. It was this transitional moment in my own academic career. Um, um, I was changing. I was morphing in
uh,
some ways. Out of those lectures came 4 books. I was working on democracy in Black.
oh,
I was
okay.
thinking about I was at the beginning of thinking about the book on Baldwin, the very short introduction on African American religion and an uncommon faith. My thinking about pragmatism was kind of coming together at the same time. So it made sense that I would return to these lectures after 13 years or so, because right now I'm not. I knew I needed to find my bearings,
Uh-huh.
you know, and these lectures were so important in that moment. And here I am now, kind of adrift, and so I wanted to kind of, how can I put it? A bit of grief and bitter disappointment had led me to lose my footing,
Mm.
and so I needed to return to this moment to see what I was doing, right? To see what I was up to, and the result was, this book.
It's an excellent book and it's doing
Thank you.
so well. You gave the lecture at Harvard and it's published by Harvard University Press. And it's an academic book, but it's so, you've got so much of your personal kind of reflection in there. And, I've known you for a while. We were on the AAR board together,
Mhm.
and I always you're always, like, one of the best dressed people at AAR or anywhere you go, and then I felt you were, like, a little vulnerable here.
Mhm.
So tell us about that because that part, your vulnerability, which I didn't expect in the book, was so moving and touching for someone like me.
Yeah, you know, I, there's, I mean, it's almost cliche, Grace, in some ways, to say that this is the through line of the book, that we have to become better people,
Mm,
that we have to stop outsourcing our responsibility for democracy
mhm,
to so-called prophets and heroes, that we can be prophetic, that we can be heroic in our day-to-day lives, right? And if we're going to be the leaders that we're looking for, we have to be better people. And if we're going to be better people, we have to deal with us. We have to deal with ourselves. And Baldwin has this wonderful formulation that I live with, that shook me at my core. He said, "The messiness of the world is actually a reflection, in part, of the messiness of our interior lives." And that part of what we have to do if we're going to reach for higher forms of excellences is that we have to deal with the wounds that make us who we are. And so, the second chapter of the book is a deeply personal
yeah,
kind of framing, with my father, this man
mhm,
who is so important to me. And, I hesitated to write it because, he's the most responsible human being I've ever met in my life. Without him, I wouldn't be. But I was so afraid of him. He
Mhm.
scared the living daylights out of me. And he deposited a kind of fear in my gut that led me to believe that at the heart of me, I was a coward. And so I found myself reaching for heroes. And Malcolm X became the way in which I reconstituted my sense of masculinity, Black masculinity, right? So I wanted to tell that story about, wound, to try to help us think about that complicated relationship between piety, wound, and self-creation.
Mm.
How do we think about our indebtedness to the sources of who we take ourselves to be? How do we think about that indebtedness in relation to the wounds, the hard love and the bruises left by those who love us? And that arduous hard work of trying to create a self in light of the world in which you happen to live. So I had to be vulnerable on the page as a writer in that moment. Otherwise, it wouldn't have worked.
Yeah, I'm so grateful that you were because I've never sensed that, with interactions with you and when I see you on social media or on television. So that was so moving for me. And I'm just so grateful that you included that piece. I'm sure it was hard to write about. I think for Asian Americans to write about something like that, so personal, it's really hard. So I'm just so grateful that you shared it and it's giving courage, I'm sure, for many other people to be able to share their stories and their vulnerabilities. So
Thank you.
thank you.
Thank you. Yeah, I think, as writers, particularly as scholars,
Uh-huh.
oftentimes we want to hide behind objectivity. We want to
Yeah.
hide behind a kind of detachment.
Mhm.
And our prose reflects it, right? I mean, it's kind of often dry, and sometimes it doesn't have the passion and that we really feel about the ideas. And I think to implicate ourselves in what we're thinking about, to place, to place who we are squarely at the center of it all. Well, it announces why it matters in the first place, right? It does that, but it also exposes us
Mm,
in some ways, and I think it occasions opportunities for us to grow as thinkers
mm,
together, right? It seems to
yeah.
me, yeah,
Yeah, so I'm so grateful coming
yeah,
from a scholar. I think that's so important. And, many women do it, but not so many men. So I'm
yeah.
just so grateful that you're doing this and sharing a part of your struggle and part of your childhood, which is, as you said, it really helped form you because, Malcolm X that you encountered in college was like a conversion experience that you kind of wrote about. So tell us about that, how you felt it was a conversion experience reading about Malcolm X.
Yeah, I left home at 16 to go to college,
Oh,
so I went to
why so
Morehouse.
young? How so young?
Yeah,
Just
Morehouse
yeah.
has this. They have this early admit program
Oh my.
that they started. Martin Luther King was an early admit, actually. And they
Um,
started in response to the war because so many men had gone off to fight in the war. So they were admitting younger students. And so I
you were
wanted to get,
16?
yeah, I basically ran away from home. I wanted to get away from my father.
Oh, okay.
And instead of running away from home into the streets, I ran to college.
I see.
And I remember I was walking around Morehouse's campus, and this senior gave me, he said, "You're like a hand without a thumb. I mean, you're so brilliant, but you don't know who you are." And he gave me Malcolm X's autobiography.
Oh,
And I read it that night from cover to cover. And
wow.
suddenly I had this epiphany. The language, the anger, it all made sense to me. This was my dad. This was because my dad was deeply skeptical about the moral standing of white folks. He was rageful at times. And so I had this language to account for him, and I had this language to account for something that was in my own gut, as it were. And so I decided to reorient my life. I became this Black nationalist on Morehouse's campus. I
Wow.
started I started hanging out with particular sorts of folks. I started reading Walter Rodney and Stokely Carmichael's, Carmichael Speaks or Stokely Speaks, and listening to tapes of Malcolm's speeches and whatnot. And I write in the book because, I'm a country boy from Mississippi. I write in the book that, I'm hanging around these so-called revolutionaries and they all smelled a certain way. They had a certain odor. And I thought it was because they were in rooms full of incense. So I got the incense, Grace, and I would rub them on my neck. I didn't know if it was oil. There were oils that they were using. Because, for me, I'm just this country boy, and Black nationalism is as foreign to me as Islam, right? But it was in that moment that I found a political language
Mm,
within which I could imagine myself. I
mm,
could be a Black man. Malcolm was my shining Black prince. I could be courageous. I could, I wouldn't feel out of place and out of time anymore because
mm.
I was imitating my hero. So I have my goatee to this day as a testimony to that conversion experience.
Wow.
Yeah. I will never shave it off.
That's
Absolutely.
amazing because you always wonder why people wear certain things. And
Mhm.
okay, so thank you for sharing that. It looks great, by the way, and
Thank you.
as you're aging, it looks fabulous.
Thank you.
So in the book, you go through Malcolm X, Dr. King, and Ella Baker. But before we go even deeper, I want you to, well, you share in the book about Obama. And I was really glad of all the things you wrote because as an Asian American woman, it's hard for me to critique someone with that are not part of my own ethnic kind of community. But
Mhm.
you were critical about Obama, and so share a little bit about that because I found that so interesting in the book and kind of grateful for you to do it.
I got in so much trouble back then, when I wrote it. I was more explicit in democracy and Black, but I was really unsettled that Obama was being read as the culmination of the Black freedom struggle.
Yeah.
That somehow, the sacrifices of the mid 20th century were all in the service of him becoming the president of the United States, that he was the fulfillment of Dr. King's dream. That to me seemed heretical, right? It didn't make any sense. And it was part of, in my view, this ongoing process, this ongoing effort to narrow the range of what constitutes legitimate forms of political dissent. That Black politics were being kind of squeezed into this narrow box of just simply liberal politics, the politics of the Democratic Party. And so part of what I wanted to do was to disrupt that. You even heard it in Obama's, Chicago address about fathers and the like, or his commencement address at Morehouse of all places, or even during the 50th anniversary of the March on Washington, Grace, when he narrates the Black freedom struggle and he talks about 1954, 1955, 1963, the March on, and then he says we lost our way. So Black Power becomes this narrative of declension, right? The moment in which we lose sight of the power of the Black freedom, and I just found it deeply disturbing. So what I wanted to do in the lectures then, not so
Mhm,
much now, but
mhm,
what I wanted to do then is to say, look, we cannot, give over our tradition to this moment. That what the Black freedom struggle calls us to do and what it calls us to, who it calls us to be, is much more than just simply an election or who occupies the White House. There's a deep ethical ought at the heart of this tradition, um, that that should lead you to be critical of some of the policies coming out of this White House, right? So,
mhm.
so I got in a lot of trouble for that, but I was okay with it.
Well, I'm glad you were the one that was outspoken. At least you make sense in your arguments. Other people who are critical, sometimes it didn't make any sense. So, I remember you speaking out at that time too. And I'm just grateful that it kind of made it into this book because I think we need to, because your book is about leaders and we need to be critical of the leaders. And
Mhm.
so I felt like he was so embraced. He got the Nobel Peace Prize. And you think, wow, there were so many other people who could have gotten it. So anyway, I think, your critical view and because you're kind of within that tradition, I thought that was so helpful. So thank you for
Thank you.
including that.
Thank you. Yeah. Yeah. Can you imagine he got the Nobel? Anyway. Well, we'll talk about that some other time.
But you can talk about it now because I was shocked.
No, I mean the drone program, and I mean, I just it, the idea that I think it has something to do with the way in which a certain politics of representation can can skew one's moral vision, that you just
Yeah.
simply see a black body or a woman or a person of color and you think somehow that justice is being instantiated by virtue of that representation, and it's just not true. It's just not true. And so the idea that the United States had elected this black man as the president somehow constituted this overarching gesture towards peace was baffling, given the U.S. empire and what it was doing around the globe. It,
Yeah.
but
Oh, you just said it so well. Thank you for what you just said. And almost like he was viewed as this fulfillment of some prophecy. I don't know if you're gonna bring in the religious kind of realm into it. That's how it felt.
Oh, absolutely, absolutely. And part of what I've been trying to, what part of what I try to do in the book, Grace, is to bring that notion of prophecy down to the ground so it won't happen again.
Yeah.
Right? We don't need, whether it's Obama or whether it's Reverend Jackson or whether it's Reverend Sharpton,
Yeah.
we don't need these larger than life figures who call us to leave behind our own voices and follow them. We need to be fully ourselves in our efforts to secure the goods that we think are worth risking everything for. We can't give over our responsibility for the collective well-being of the communities within which we live, it seems to me. But
Well, and you argue that so well in the book. And before I read the book, I was like, at least within the African American community, you have Dr. King, you have all these other people, Malcolm X, and Ella Baker, and all these other people that were kind of ahead of you that you can read about. And my always struggle was, well, I can't really find that many Asian Americans who are part of this struggle that I can kind of look up to. So I think I've reflected on that many times. And so actually reading your book was kind of life-changing because I've always been searching. At least you have these people, and I've only named a
wow.
few. And like Asian American and then Asian American women, there's so few. So I've always been searching. And then your book was like, bang, it just kind of challenged me and it brought me down that, we are the leaders we have been looking for. So, I'm really grateful for that. I didn't think that the book would be challenging to me. I just wanted to read it and have you on. But after reading it, it was very challenging and really is now making me rethink about my lifelong search for an Asian American leader that I can kind of look up to. So,
Yeah, I think part of what I'm trying to suggest is that, you know, particularly for those of us who were born in Gen Xers, right? Um, and I came of age in the shadow of the greatest generation America's ever produced, in my view. I wasn't a part of the '60s revolution in the United States,
mhm,
and I came of age in the age of Reagan politically, right? And so I've always felt like I was born out of space and out of time, right? That somehow I was just a latecomer. They used to say, boy, if I was in the '60s, I would have stood post in the nation. I would have served in the breakfast program with the Black Panther Party. I would have been a part of the movement and all of this other stuff. And what happens is that you find yourself lost in a kind of imitative mode,
mm,
a kind of nostalgic longing.
mm,
And what gets lost in that is the hard work of self-cultivation. So
mm.
the argument of the book, one of the central arguments of the book is this notion of self-cultivation in the pursuit of justice. What do we do? What does it mean to reach for higher forms of excellences, to try to become that better human being in a world that's organized in such a way that gets in the way of that effort? And so first thing we can't do is give ourselves over to people.
Okay.
I don't want to lose my voice,
Uh-huh.
lose my distinctiveness in my effort to imitate Malcolm.
Mm,
Malcolm comes to me as an exemplar of what I am capable of. right? All of these folk come to us, to use Emerson's language. Great people come to us such that even greater people are possible, can be possible. And if we understand ourselves in that way, then we open us up to, I mean, what can't we do when we imagine ourselves in the grandest of terms? Even if we recognize our limitations.
Wow, you are so inspirational. I never thought of you as a Black preacher, but
Yeah.
that was like you were just preaching to me there.
Thank you.
So, thank you for that. So, as you know, you touch these three major kind of thinkers and movers and leaders. So, with Dr. King, tell us a bit about that because he has become larger than life. And we know that he had all these other problems, etc. But he is this kind of, there is this Dr. King legacy that, we have, Dr. King, Martin Luther King Day. So tell us
Mhm.
about that and how, what are we supposed to do with a leader figure like that?
When you tell the history of movements by way of great men and women, oftentimes that focus, right, blurs or obscures what's happening closer to the ground. When we tell the story of the civil rights movement as if it's a story of Dr. King's
Yeah.
ascendance and his assassination, then
Uh-huh.
we lose sight of the work of sharecroppers in Mississippi. We lose sight of organizers like Ella Baker and others of Student Nonviolent Coordinating Committee, churches, and the work that everyday ordinary people who decided to risk everything in the effort, in the blow for freedom. And so I want to suggest that this great man's approach to civil rights history gets in the way of us really understanding what everyday ordinary people did. And so King, for me, is often deployed
Uh-huh.
for particular purposes. And what I mean by that is that there's a certain story of the civil rights movement, a certain story of Dr. King that aims to discipline how you and I think about politics. So King is invoked as a way of saying that's not an option. This is the only way you can imagine politics. King is invoked as a way to command supplication as opposed to thinking imaginatively on your own terms. We have to, in some ways, duplicate his approach to struggle, right? We have to figure out how to walk his path. And so part of what I try to do in the first chapter is to bring the prophetic down to the ground, that these prophets aren't larger than life folk who are authorized by an authority outside of us. They don't bring the word of God, that the prophetic is in fact a decision of conduct. It's the exercise of the moral imagination. And it takes on a certain kind of resonance, particularly when we're fighting for a more just world. And so we all can do this. And so I wanted to return to King's 1957 speech, where he calls us all to be active participants in transforming the world, not to wait on God or to wait on the prophet, right? But to understand that we have the power to be transformative agents. And so, and that was really important for me as a Morehouse graduate because I was baptized in King, right? He was so in the 8th grade in Miss Mitchell's history class. I remember reciting the "I Have a Dream" speech by, by memory. He was everything, and so I wanted to bring one of my heroes down to the ground so I could free myself to
Mm,
find my own voice.
I see. So you're making all great sense. So what happens to us when we still look up and are seeking another Dr. King? Reverend Jackson, you mentioned him earlier. I think outside of his building is like Dr. King's workshop or something to that effect. So what do we do when we are in search of another Dr. King or yeah,
Yeah, I think we abdicate our responsibility.
okay. Mhm.
We find ourselves drowning in nostalgia. Oh, if only we had another Dr. King, right? When in fact we need a Grace, we need an Eddie,
Yeah.
right? We need you.
Yeah.
And I think part of what we have to do is to understand these examples, these courageous men and women, as really examples for us in our own moment, in our own time. It doesn't mean that we all can become Dr. King. That would be silly, right? I don't want to say that it's not a leveling project where none of us that there's no difference in talent and skill. We all are different in our own ways, but we all have the capacity to exercise our talents on behalf of a just world, in the pursuit of a more just world. And so part of how can I put this in a much more direct way? When we lay down our spades and we follow the prophet or the hero, we arrest the hard work of self-cultivation.
Uh-huh.
We stop working on ourselves and we follow them.
That's
And that's not good.
Yeah, I that is so true, and you say it very clearly in the book. So I was so grateful for that. And when you get into Malcolm X, you're talking about. For me, I don't know enough about Malcolm X as I do more about Dr. King, but you kind of mentioned this, that he's not this prince, but this wounded person,
Yeah.
and how heroes can disable us and heroes can be dangerous because you encountered X, when you were just 16, I guess, at Morehouse. So say us a little bit about Malcolm X and how he became the surrogate father to you, and how are we supposed to deal with him, now, all
Yeah.
these decades later.
Yeah, he's so important to me in so many ways that he allowed me to address my fears, by um, performing a certain kind of courageous masculinist stance. But when I was reading with Imani Perry, Manning Marble's Pulitzer Prize winning biography on Malcolm, A Life of Reinvention. And, she said to me once, she said, after he left the nation, he said, after Malcolm left the nation, he's just flailing and failing over and over again. And so Manning Marble took himself to be kind of recovering the true Malcolm from the artifice of the autobiography. What I found instead of the true Malcolm was a wounded witness. He was all too human. The man who was larger than life for me became an example of someone working through his stuff, working through his mess, and doing so in an effort to make himself, as James W.C. Pennington would say, to make himself more efficient for good. Right. And so what I end up with is not the shining black prince, but someone closer to the ground, someone who's trying to make sense of his life, right? And trying to do so in the context of trying to make a better world.
Mm.
And so that's a different example for me. That's not someone that I give myself over to. That's someone I follow, that's someone I work alongside. That's someone I find resources in. Um, um, and suddenly I'm released to be more fully my own self, if that makes sense.
Oh, that makes so much sense. Oh, that's so beautifully said. So thank you about that.
Yeah.
Thank you for that. And in your book, then you moved to Ella Baker,
Yeah.
and I learned so much about her through your book. So tell us a bit about her and her work and why she's so important for you when we're talking about we are the leaders that we are looking for.
Uh,
So yeah,
Yeah, yeah, it makes sense, right? Here, I
yeah,
began the book with these two men, these two
uh-huh,
heroes, King and Malcolm. I talk about the masculinist politics of Malcolm, that he allows me to, he's my surrogate father to find a sense of manhood. And then I end with this approach that comes from Ella Baker that's rooted not in the pulpit, but in the pews.
mhm,
Right? Miss Baker wants to affirm the dignity and standing of everyday ordinary folk. Her politics is not about a performance, but a politics of tending, a politics of care, right? Of really kind of understanding that we all have the capacity, right, to be transformative agents in the world. That the objective is to expand who matters in the demos. And without Ella Baker, the mid 20th century doesn't make sense.
mm,
She was a field secretary in the 1940s for the NAACP, organizing Southern chapters, So without her meeting Amzie Moore in Mississippi, Bob Moses and Stick would have never met Amzie Moore when he went to Mississippi. That's that connection generationally. She was the first executive director of SCLC, the Southern Christian Leadership Conference. So she had to deal with all of those preachers as she organized SCLC. And then, during the 1960, with all of those student sit-ins and the student energy crop, in Nashville and Atlanta and in North Carolina, those students organized the Student Nonviolent Coordinating Committee at Shaw University in April of 1960. Why at Shaw? That's Miss Baker's alma mater. And she kept King and Roy Wilkins from trying to co-opt that student energy. And what's at the heart of her view? She has this wonderful formulation. She says, a strong people don't need strong leaders. And so the idea is to create the conditions under which indigenous folk on the ground understand themselves as responsible for securing the good in their own lives. And so what SNCC exemplified at its height was not helicoptering in and organizing a march and everybody follows and creating the spectacle and then leaving. No, they created the conditions under which a Unita Blackwell, a Fannie Lou Hamer, indigenous leadership would emerge. And then they would organize and secure and fight for the right to vote, fight for the distribution of resources that would benefit the life chances of folk in that community. And so for me, her chastened voluntarism, her militant egalitarianism, her experimentalism, all of that feeds into this insistence that at the end of the day, if we're going to fundamentally transform democratic life in this country, everyday ordinary people have to be the leaders that we're looking for.
That is so powerful for me. So I'm really grateful for that because of my ongoing search for this leader when we can be the leader ourselves. So as you're talking about, the Democratic movement and, this is the election year, I do want to ask the question about, well, it's two-part. Especially within the African American community, the so-called the big leaders have come from a religious background. So they are
Mhm.
ordained ministers, they have the pulpit before they get into the politics or other areas. And then the part two is, what about Cornel West and his run for presidency?
Yeah, the latter question is a hard one.
Okay.
And in so many ways, this book is an argument with him, like all my work has been in some ways. Um, I
But he knows about you
oh
arguing.
yeah, I gave him the manuscript
And
before,
what
and
did he
what
say? Did he like it?
he has his disagreements with it, but I was so nervous to send it to him,
I would have been
and
terrified to send it to him.
and Grace, I sent it to him, and the next day at 8:30 p.m. he called me to
Oh,
respond to. He had read the entire thing in less than 24 hours.
what did he say? Tell us.
He said that I had stretched pragmatism in a way that once again proved that I was one of the leading pragmatist thinkers in the country. But he had his disagreements with the way in which I was reading the prophetic and the heroic, and the ongoing and the role of leaders. I have a deep suspicion of the way in which Cornell enacts his understanding of the prophetic,
What is
and
that? What do you mean?
he he in the way in which he's currently running for the presidency.
Uh-huh, uh-huh.
Right, I don't think he's creating the conditions under which everyday folk understand their power.
Oh,
Right,
okay.
he's inhabiting the role of the leader in a way that I want to deconstruct.
I see. I
And
didn't
I
see
don't
it that way, but now that you say it, maybe I do see it that way.
Yeah, and I want to,
Uh-huh.
the demos deliberating, everyday people striking the blow for freedom. That's the language that Cornell gave me early on as a graduate student. And so running for the presidency of the United States isn't something that I associate with the way in which I've read him and I've learned from him over the years. So, but again, the book is an act of piety in relationship to him because I'm engaging him, I'm disagreeing with him because I'm trying to figure out where he ends and where I begin.
Okay.
So I think that's the first thing. So, and the second thing is that, you know, these we have to my mind, Grace, we have to disrupt the Black political class.
Mm.
We have to this custodial model of politics where you have a leadership class that represents the interest of Black communities to white America or to the White House or whatever. We have to disrupt that, in my view, in order to empower local communities, everyday ordinary folk, and to do their work closer to the ground.
But how do you disrupt that? Because I feel that the African American community is searching for that leader, whether it be Al Sharpton, Reverend Al Sharpton, or Cornel West.
Right. And I'm trying desperately in this book to say, stop searching for them, work with them, and look to yourselves.
Okay.
So
Okay.
I'm not trying to discard the notion of leadership. We have leaders,
Yeah.
right? But I don't want us to
Them to
have an
search.
orientation of supplication.
Uh-huh. Okay.
We want to hold them to account and hold ourselves to account as we work for a more just world.
Uh, That is so strong. So yes, thank you for that. And then the first question about the religious leaders, because it just so happens with Dr. King, Reverend Jackson, Reverend Sharpton, we do have this religious leader in the pulpit kind of coming out into politics or talking about justice issues.
I think we need to be very, very careful and critical in this moment
Okay.
because
Yes.
for a decade or so, for decades, we have had an understanding of the gospel that has been in alignment with neoliberalism.
Mm,
We've had this prosperity gospel that has overrun American Christendom and Black Christendom in particular, Black Protestantism in particular. And
mhm,
so, if it is definitely the case that Black churches play an important, outsized role in our communities because of its institutional presence. But we also need, I think, more prophetic voices within those churches, right? To offer a vision that is more consonant with, I think, the message and ministry of Jesus than some of this stuff that we've been hearing over the last few years.
Okay, so thank you. So what is the hope? What is our hope for a better world? How do we create this better world? Like, how do we enable ourselves to be the leader and work alongside the named leader that we've mentioned over and over again? Like, how do we do that practically? Um, because there's so many good things, and then I'm kind of wondering, how am I going to do this? Because I think many of us feel so powerless in so many
Yeah.
instances. Who's going to listen to me? Or I'm not that important. I feel like a nobody 99% of the time. So what is it that you want to offer for someone like me? What is our hope for this
Yeah.
just world that we want to build
First
together?
of all, I want us to reject that assumption that we're nobody, that our voices don't matter, right? In fact, I want to say that in the ongoing effort of reaching for a higher self, of trying to become a better human being in the pursuit of a more just world, we're doing work there. That the fact that I'm working on me, right, matters. That of just being a more decent, a more loving. I actually use this phrase, Grace, that we need a coalition of the decent to
Mhm,
save the country,
mhm.
right? And so
I like that.
working on myself is really important. But also there are problems right in front of us, right? Problems right in your community, right? And working with others in pursuit of that just world, whether it's around issues of education, whether it's around issues of women's right to choose, whether it's around mass incarceration, right? There are specific issues within the communities that you live close to the ground, right in front of you, where you can begin to do the hard work of building a more just world. And you don't do that by giving yourself over to an organization or to leaders, but by engaging in the work. And so we don't understand our power until we exercise it.
Mm,
We don't understand our power until we exercise it. And what's so insidious about our current political moment is that
mhm.
they don't want us to exercise it because they know how powerful we can actually be.
Wow. Wow. Thank you so much, Dr. Eddie Cloud. Um, Today, we discussed We Are the Leaders We Have Been Looking For, published by Harvard University Press. This book is so inspirational to me unexpectedly because it's an academic book and I didn't expect it to be so inspirational. And this discussion has been so enlightening to me, so empowering. I am so grateful for your work. You know, you teach at Princeton, but you do all this other stuff around the globe. Thank you so much for coming on Madang Podcast, hosted by Christian Century, to share your latest book and how we are the leaders that we have been looking for today.
Thank you so much. What a blessing. What a blessing. Take
Thank
care.
you. Homebird Christianity's Theology Beer Camp tickets are now available. It will be held October 17 to 19 in Denver with fabulous speakers such as Diana Butler-Bass, Brian McLaren, Ilya Delio, and John Tatalamo, and so many more. Please go to www.theologybeer.camp to register. You can use discount code Return of Madang for $25 off registration. Please register today. Join Homebrew Christianity's new online class, Faith and Politics for the Rest of Us, led by Dr. Diana Butler-Bass, Dr. Tripp Fuller, and Tim Whitaker. They're bringing together a number of alternative theopolitical visions to introduce a multiplicity of vibrant yet neglected traditions in public theology. With the help of some of the most powerful voices in the Academy, participants will be introduced to these traditions and get to put them into action as we wrestle with our present moment, discovering the potential for an alternative public Christian witness. You will get 5 live stream sessions, Q&A time, online community, and so much more. Please go to www.faithandpolitics.net to register for this upcoming amazing new class. 1001 New Worshiping Communities has been igniting and supporting flourishing new faith communities in every context through the Presbyterian Church USA since 2012. 1001 has started over 750 communities and has trained over 1,000 leaders to begin creative, diverse, and new expressions of what it means to follow Jesus. You can hear about those stories on their podcast called New Way, which you can find on their website, newchurchnewway.org. 1001 will be sponsoring a tent at the Wild Goose Festival this year called the Tent of Make-Believe. So please register for the Wild Goose Festival and meet 1001 there.
For sponsorship inquiries, please email madangpodcast.gmail.com.